to this work. We're going to try to recognize some common co-occurring disorders, especially some pairings. We're going to try to support some early engagement and recovery work, recognizing, especially non-clinical supports, and using these whole person strategies. One of the key ideas I want to start with is this idea that the relationship is very much the centerpiece of any work you do when you're working with pretty much anyone, but also very important when we're working with co-occurring disorders. I'm going to introduce this idea of recovery capital, which if any of you have ever been in one of my trainings, you've probably heard me say it. It's a very important idea, but we're going to talk a little bit about that later. And we're going to keep it all practical by relating it back to the 5 functional domains of CCSS practice. So again, we're going to talk about that relationship quality first. Then we're going to get into the basics of co-occurring disorders. Then we're going to talk about this idea of social determinants of health and how recovery capital can help address those challenges. Keep it practical by relating it back to the functional domains. And then we're going to do quite a bit of activities, quite a few activities. So it should be a lot of hands-on learning. So this is the sort of opening premise of this whole project. Community health and support work matters, especially when we're supporting people with co-occurring disorders, because recovery and stability usually do not happen in one place, through one professional or because of one intervention. They do not happen only in therapy, and they do not happen only because someone was prescribed the right medication. Those things can matter a great deal, of course. Therapy can be very important, medication can be essential, but they're only part of the picture. For people living with both mental health and substance use challenges, a great deal of the work of change actually happens in everyday life. So we're thinking about it happening between those moments, between appointments. We're thinking about it happening when somebody's trying to get through a really difficult situation without using, whether they're going to even pick up the phone, right? Trying to make it to appointments, take their medication, whether or not they're going to ask for help, leave an unsafe situation, or come back after a setback. It happens while we're managing cravings, depression, anxiety, trauma, family stress, housing instability, shame, or just being exhausted. So that's part of why community health and support work matters so much. We're often helping people carry treatment into the reality of their daily lives. That's also why the quality of your relationship with your clients matters a lot. If the clients trust you, feels like you're on their team, and like you care, you'll be able to move mountains. Many people have been judged, rushed, misunderstood, talked down to, or made to feel like they were too complicated or not ready. When that happens enough times, it makes sense that trust can come slowly. So when we show up with steadiness, curiosity, respect, and follow through, we are really helping create the conditions in which a person can begin to feel safe enough to re-engage or engage for the first time. So technical skill alone is not enough. It's important, of course. Knowledge is important. But neither one of those things automatically creates change in the person's life. A therapist may do excellent work in a session, a prescriber might find the right medication, but the person still has to live their life outside of the office. And they still have to make it through the week. They still have to manage triggers, tolerate emotions, get to appointments, return after missing one, cope with stress, handle conflict, and try again when all those things don't go as planned. So support work is often what helps connect what happens in that office to real life. It helps take care, make care more usable, more human, and more possible. I think it's also really important to gently challenge the idea that real change only happens in therapy or because of medications. And that support work is somehow secondary. In practice, especially with co-occurring disorders, change is usually spread across many moments, many providers, many different conversations, many different community members, and a whole lot more. Medication, of course, might reduce symptoms or cravings, and therapy can create insight and emotional movement. But support work is actually often what helps people actually do the transformational work in their communities, where they live, and with the people that they're actually seeing most of the time. We as therapists only see people once a week, or if we're in an IOP, 9-10 hours a week, which is still a lot, but it's not nearly what somebody spends in their own community. So in practice, we're going to start with a position of curiosity. We're not going to make assumptions, and we're going to build trust and safety slowly. mostly by showing up consistently and by managing ourselves, of course. And this is because for many people who have co-occurring disorders, that trust has been broken over and over again. They've been, and breaking that trust, again, I want to come back to this idea of being rushed. Like little things like that can really tip somebody if we don't think about how to do that carefully. And so there's never a single right way to support everyone, but the point of this slide is really quite simple. It's that community health and support work really does matter. The relationship quality matters, and technical skill alone is not enough, especially for these folks that we're talking about today. Healing is not going to be confined to therapy or the medication visit. A great deal of it's going to happen in those relationships, in community, in ordinary life. And I see a hand up, Sabrina.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. I just
Sure.
want to check in with our interpreters. Our participant who had requested for this services so they can't hear you. Can you please just check your mics are working? Thank you so much.
All right. So bottom line is also sort of what this bottom citation, excuse me, the citation at the bottom is also getting at this idea. The science shows this, which is across treatment models, these common factors like the ability to feel like you're in relationship with somebody or you have alliance with that person, a provider of some kind, are consistently associated with positive outcomes, right? So these relationships are not just some ancillary part of what you're doing. They are central to it. And in fact, to do this work well, we have to really tend to this relationship. This slide's making a simple but important point as well. Relationship quality is not extra. It helps build those conditions that make good support possible. When the relationship is strong, it helps build trust, safety, honesty, openness, and hope. And those are not exactly small things. For most folks, especially with co-occurring disorders, those are the very things that have often been damaged in previous helping relationships or by life experiences more broadly. It also affects very practical parts of the work. It affects how honest someone is during assessment. It affects whether they can come back or they want to come back. It affects whether they're ready to accept help. It affects whether they can begin to believe that recovery is actually possible. So again, this is not just about being nice and warm because it's a good thing to do. Of course it is. But if the client feels like you're on their team, that you care, and that they're safe with you, they're much more likely to tell you what's actually happening in their lives. And they're much more likely to stay engaged, keep coming back, and work with you. Some of the quickest ways to lose engagement are rushing to judgment. And then again, this idea of rushing the client themselves, struggling for power, and ignoring their lived reality. People usually know when they're being sized up or talked down to, or even quietly blamed. And once that happens, honesty is going to be one of the first victims. Not people aren't going to trust you, they're not going to be willing to tell you what's actually happening. Rushing, of course, does the same thing. When someone is living with a co-occurring disorder, they often need a little more time to feel safe and make sense of what to say, even if it's just to figure out whether the relationship is going the way that they want it to go, whether or not it's going to be different from previous relationships with other helping professionals. So if we move too fast, we can make the mistake of misunderstanding what's happening when what's really going on is a kind of self-protection. Power struggles also tend to shut things down. The moment the interaction becomes about control, in other words, you're trying to take control of a situation and sort of force the point, we often lose something really important. What helps more is staying grounded, of course, staying curious, and being willing to work collaboratively. When we ignore lived reality, people can feel really unseen in a very real way. Housing instability, trauma, exhaustion, stigma, loss, family stress, and past experiences with failed systems are not side issues. They're often central to what the person is carrying into the session with you or into their casework with you. So often what looks like resistance is actually fear. It could be shame. It can be trauma. It can be exhaustion. Or just a very realistic response to, many failed attempts at working with helping professionals in the past. So we're going to do a little activity. I'm going to take about 5 minutes in small groups to discuss these two questions. What helps people feel safe enough to be honest? What makes people shut down, avoid, or disengage? Try to keep this grounded in real practice, like your actual experiences working with clients. Of course, respect client confidentiality in all cases, but try to work with the actual material you've got. And don't give us answers that we want to hear. Like let's really hear about it, like what it's like to do this work. I think it'll all help us all understand how this looks. And then we're going to come back together and you're going to share, some of the folks are going to share out what they've been talking about. If folks would put in the chat, or if you want to come off your mic real quick and share a couple of things that you came up with in your groups. We don't have a whole lot of time, but I'd love to hear from one or two folks.
Well, most people in my group were saying, being relatable, calm, compassionate, understanding, meeting them where they're at, not bringing them to where you expect them or feel they should be.
Perfect. Yeah. Wonderful. Anybody else? Maybe one more. I see a couple in the chat. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, a few things we talked about. We only had enough time apparently for one question, but we talked about like professional use of self, so being able to share, ways, oftentimes folks, when they first meet us, they're like, you can't possibly understand what I'm going through, and so, being thinking deeply about like how we would use, our own prior experiences in order to kind of calm the client. And then just, sincerity, right? Making sure that our actions actually match what our words and things are, and just being able, and then setting expectations. That was the other thing that we covered.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, the word that kind of comes to mind when you both were speaking is the word authenticity, right? You can't really be authentic if you're faking it. You can't really be authentic if you don't follow through. And you can't be really compassionate if you're not authentic, right? Like people see right through that. Like that's that false sympathy that I think many of us have felt if you've ever been a client or a patient. And it's not great. So we're gonna move on. Um, let's see here. So kind of coming back to this practice point, support work is essential to effective co-occurring care because people spend far more time in their communities than they do in their clinics. And that means a lot of the recovery work, again, happens in daily life, not just during those appointments. Happens with those authentic moments between you and the client, right? And support workers are often the first persons to notice notice the barriers, but also the strengths of the people who are coming into these, whether or not you're in a treatment program or in a community center or wherever. You're the ones who are likely going to see what's getting in the way. You're going to be the first people to really notice those things. And you have an opportunity there to share that with the other clinicians and the prescribers. And that is a really important entree for those folks because a lot of times they're going to be intimidated by the prescribers and intimidated by the psychotherapists and the counselors because they've got a lot of letters after their name or whatever it is. And you all, because of that authentic relationship, can step in and really help transition them to, talking to those prescribers and therapists in a way that a lot of other folk can't. So, what are co-occurring disorders? When we're talking about co-occurring disorders, we're talking about, again, a mental health challenge and a substance use challenge at the same time. It's important to understand that these are often interacting and synergizing. By interacting, I mean each one can affect the other and back and forth. For example, somebody might feel depressed, they might use alcohol or other drugs to get relief from that, and then they're going to feel even more depressed afterwards, especially if they continue the use for some time. Or someone might have a lot of anxiety. They might use cannabis or benzodiazepines to calm down. Very effective in the short term. But then they become more anxious over time, especially as their tolerance and their fear of withdrawal increases. By synergizing, I'm talking about two problems combining in a way that makes the overall situation worse than the sum of the two together. So it's not just depression plus drinking or trauma plus stimulant use. It's that together they increase the risk, the instability, and the impairment in a much more powerful way. A person with PTSD and methamphetamine use, for example, may become more emotionally overwhelmed, more dysregulated, more sleep deprived, and more vulnerable to paranoia or crisis than they would have been from either of those conditions alone, even if they were just added together. In other words, they make it exponentially worse. And so that's part of why we want to start talking about taking an integrated view. We don't want to assume too quickly which problem should be addressed first. We want to ask what is causing the greatest impairment or risk right now? What is most urgent? What is making it hardest for the person to function or stay safe? So again, we're not trying to say when we're talking about co-occurring disorders that you treat one and then the other. You treat them both based on the risk and necessity in the moment, right? Don't forget also that mental health and substance use can be shaped by trauma, pain, stress, and instability. So part of a good support is not splitting that person into different categories, but rather trying to understand how all these problems are happening at the same time, how they are kind of meshing with one another, how one is influencing the other. And again, this idea of interacting or synergizing. Because if we don't, we can miss something really quite important. There are a few reasons co-occurring disorders are so common. One is shared risk factors. The same things that increase risk for mental health challenges can also increase risk for substance use problems. That includes things like trauma, chronic stress, pain, instability, isolation, and early adverse experiences. Another is self-medication. So a lot of folks use substances because they're trying to get relief. They may be trying to calm anxiety. They might be trying to numb emotional pain, literal or physical pain. They might be trying to sleep. They might be trying to feel less depressed, of course, or they might be trying to quiet trauma symptoms. It might help for a short time, but again, as we discussed a moment again with interacting and synergizing, it often creates new problems while making the original ones worse. And then there's social and structural stress. That includes things like poverty, unsafe housing, violence in the community, racism, stigma, lack of access to care, repeated instability. All of that can wear a person down. These are not background issues, again. They can be a big part of why co-occurring problems develop in the first place. These problems also tend to persist for reasons that make sense. Instability makes it a lot harder to recover, of course. Pain can drive both emotional distress and substance use. Sleep disruption can make everything much worse. And fragmented or inaccessible care means people often don't get the help when they actually need it, if they get it at all. So when I'm talking about co-occurring disorders and saying they're really quite common, part of the reason is that the same vulnerabilities that shape both, and people often try to manage one while making the other worse. There are some pairings that come up again and again in co-occurring care, and it's useful to know them because they can guide what we listen for, what questions we ask, and what risks we keep in mind. Don't feel like you have to memorize this slide, but maybe when they send out the slides, this is the one that you'll come back to, at least until it's second nature. One common pairing is anxiety or depression with alcohol use. In practice, that can look like somebody drinking to calm down, to sleep, to take the edge off, or to get a little relief from sadness or worry. But remember what I was saying about interaction and synergizing. Because over time, alcohol often makes both anxiety and depression much worse, even if it really did feel like it helped in the at first. Part of what is going on here is what's called a homeostasis. I'm sure many of you have heard that term, but over time, what that means is that the relief that the alcohol was providing gets much weaker and weaker, and the person needs more and more to feel the same effect. And this is true for all drugs, but we're speaking about alcohol right now. And then, of course, with more consumption of some drug, you often have a worse hangover or worse, you feel worse anyway. You feel more nauseated. You feel all of those things. And so that's part of why short-term relief can turn into long-term worsening. PTSD and substance use is another very common pairing. That might look like somebody using to numb intrusive memories, shut down emotional pain, and or to get some sleep, or stay detached from whatever they're dealing with. Again, the short-term relief might be real, but over time, the person often pays for it, and the cycle gets harder and harder to disrupt. What helps them get through a few nights becomes a habit, and then that habit, of course, has consequences. As if anybody who's worked with somebody who's been in that cycle for a couple of years, or 5 or 10 years, or 20 years, you can probably testify to the fact that it's much harder to break that cycle when it's been going on for a decade or more than it is if it's been 10 or 20 days, right? So just think about that as this sort of gradual ramp as it increases. Pain and opioid use are also a common pairing. This is one that I'd like to slow down a little bit for. People often begin in real physical pain, and sometimes psychic pain, right? Emotional pain. And opioids help in the short term. They absolutely do make you feel better. They are, basically the equivalent of our body's feel-good chemicals, right? Endorphins. We've all heard those, and they make you feel better. There's no doubt about it. And they're essential for acute or traumatic pain. So when we're getting in a car accident or anything like that, we really want to make sure that our paramedics or whomever, our surgeons, have these opioids on board, right? We don't want to be messing around with having to deal with these kinds of major traumas without them. That's why they were developed, and that's why they're most effective. But for long-term chronic pain, the evidence is actually much more mixed, and the risks become much more important, especially dependence, opioid use disorder, of course. Overdose risk goes up considerably for every month that you are on an opioid. And the situation where where fear of pain or returning of pain, fear of withdrawal, and reduced functioning, all of those start to, again, synergize, right? In some common chronic pain conditions, opioids have not outperformed non-opioid approaches over time, and combinations of non-opioid medications can be effective for many, many patients. So this is, of course, a really complicated picture that's not just about pain relief. And this is, of course, where we have to mind our boundaries and our roles. Support workers and therapists and the like should not be telling clients what pain medication they should or should not take. But what we can do is be extremely helpful in noticing patterns and helping the prescribers and the therapists understand what is going on. Is the person taking the medication as prescribed? Are they running out early? Are they seeming like sedated, nodding out a lot, preoccupied, desperate, or increasingly focused on the medication? Or are they avoiding other strategies, other helpful strategies like therapy or like the work you do in therapy altogether? Or is something else happening, like uncontrolled pain, fear of withdrawal, confusion, more trauma, or difficulty managing the regimen? Helping the prescriber see the full real-life picture can make a big difference, because not every concerning behavior means addiction, but some behaviors do suggest that the situation needs closer attention. ADHD and stimulant use is another one people should know about. Sometimes people with untreated ADHD are trying to focus, maybe they're trying to settle themselves or just function, and stimulants like methamphetamine may really feel helpful. At the same time, it's important not to jump to simplistic conclusions here. Treating ADHD appropriately does not automatically worsen addiction risk, and in some cases, good treatment may actually reduce that risk over time. So there's a huge difference between using meth and using Adderall as prescribed. Major depression and cannabis also show up together quite often. In practice, somebody might say cannabis helps them relax, sleep, or feel better. And that relief, again, might feel very real in the moment. But over time, it can also lead to low mood, greater avoidance of activities that we know are helpful, reduces motivation, and makes cognitive functioning more and more difficult. That is to say, it makes it more and more difficult to think about problems in a way that is productive. So again, short-term relief is not always the same thing as long-term help. And then there's psychosis with methamphetamine or cannabis. Those two often co-occur, and we really want to pay attention when those two issues are happening. Either substance can complicate the picture. Together with an underlying vulnerability, they can increase the risk of paranoia, disorganization, or other psychiatric symptoms. The stakes can get pretty high pretty fast because what began as escape or stimulation or need to stay awake to guard themselves can really push the person towards much greater instability and even psychosis. Finally, I want to name some of the myths on the right because they come up all the time in the clinic. One is that THC, which is the active ingredient in cannabis or marijuana, is an effective treatment for anxiety, depression, or PTSD. The science does not support this. Another is that alcohol helps with anxiety or depression. Again, the science does not support this, not long term. Again, any drug that makes you feel better is going to feel like a solution to a lot of psychiatric or psychological challenges that we're having. But over time, that relief is going to shift from relief to dependence. And it's important for us all to understand the difference. If somebody's using cannabis and they're able to use it recreationally and only use it once in a while, and they really, they can take it or leave it, that's very different than somebody who really has to have it because they think it really helps with their depression. And so when we see somebody who believes that it really helps with their depression, we want to have a conversation with their therapist or with their prescriber, right? Like about what kind of supports we can provide them to help them look for alternatives. Again, these symptoms can overlap, and that's part of what makes this work really quite hard. What looks like anxiety might actually be withdrawal, but it can also be trauma, and it can just be a lack of sleep. I know yesterday, our little baby kept me awake all night, and I was just not particularly able to function. And so that could have looked like I was really quite anxious or really unstable, but it was really just a lack of sleep. And I'm gonna keep coming back at sleep because I think it's one of the most undertreated. It's not just me, the science also supports this, but it's one of the most undertreated problems that a lot of our clients and folks have in the community is they just don't get enough sleep. We see it time and time again. So one of the things I want you to take away from this slide is our practice stance again is humility. Don't jump to conclusions. Let's literally listen. Let's listen to what supports are helpful and focus on that in the next steps. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of integrated care a little bit more in depth. This means that we're not treating mental health over here in one clinic and substance use over there in another like outpatient program. We're trying to do all of this in our work together. And sometimes that literally does mean you have providers in different kinds of clinics. But part of your work can be as a community support worker or as a CPSW is to really help coordinate some of that, especially the sports. This is so that the client can have continuity between all these different kinds of professionals and that the work can be more coordinated. People start sharing a lot more about what they're seeing. They start to align around those priorities. And then you all, along with the prescribers and therapists, can really make sure that the care is actually fitting the person's life the way that they're actually living it and not some sort of up on high version that somebody came up with in an ivory tower. This is really important because co-occurring disorders don't happen in isolation. Again, as we said before, they don't happen where we're depressed over here and we're using cannabis over here only some of the time. These things are happening together. They're braided together. So mental health, substance use, trauma, hunger, pain, sleep, housing, stress, family conflict, transportation, and basic instability, all that stuff affects each other. Again, think back to that idea of interacting and synergizing. So if the care is fragmented, the person ends up getting a lot of different messages, and those can be contradictory, right? One provider over here is saying do this, one provider over there is saying do that. And so what we really want to see is, because the problem is integrated, we want to see that the care is too. This also means trying to match the support to the stage of change. A person might not be ready for everything all at once, right? They might not be
A
ready
cada etapa de
to
cambio.
stop using, but they might be ready to work on some basic safety. They might be ready to work on sleep. They might be ready to work on their depression, their medical care, cutting down, or something else. And so what we're doing is we're meeting them where they're at, right? We're saying, all right, you're not ready to stop using, so we're going to take a little bit of a harm reduction approach with that. And that does mean that we are going to try to work with that client on some of those other things, because if we can reduce the impact of those other things in their life, the likelihood that the negative effects of the substance use will reduce as well is increased. In other words, if we can help somebody with their depression and they're using cannabis for their depression, right, and their symptoms for depression go down, the likelihood that they're going to need to use as much cannabis is also going to go down, right? So we're going to try to match people where they're at with whichever piece of their lives they're ready to change when they're ready to change it. And this also means that it takes a team, right? Different folks, different team members are going to see different parts of what's going on. Primary care, of course, might notice like pain or sleep problems, blood pressure problems, infections, or medication side effects, while psychiatry may be helping with depression or anxiety or trauma symptoms. Therapy, of course, might be helping them process those traumas, maybe some grief, maybe some shame, or develop relationship skills. But what I want to emphasize is this idea is that they might notice it, but often you're going to be the person who's going to be hearing about the improvements in those different specialty areas, right? And so you can help relate all of that and coordinate that care, even if you're not working on a formally integrated team. So I'm going to introduce this idea of social determinants of health. This might be the first time you've heard of social determinants of health, but you've experienced them all. These are the non-medical factors that influence health outcomes. This is everything else, right? In plain language, it refers to the conditions in which people are born, in which they grow, work, live, and age, as well as the broader forces and systems that shape daily life. So when we're talking about social determinants of health, we're talking about things like housing, transportation, food, money, safety, access to care, and the systems people have to deal with every day. This matters, of course, because if we focus only on the symptoms, we can miss a significant part of what is driving that risk or the distress or recovery. A person may want help and still not make it to treatment because they don't have a ride. They may want to sleep and not improve because they don't feel safe where they're living. They may want recovery and still keep getting pulled off track by hunger, by poverty, by violence, of course, or systems that are really hard to navigate. So when we think about whole person recovery, we have to think beyond the individual, not because the individual doesn't matter, of course, but because people are always living in context, right? We're always living in our communities, in the social groups in which we're in. It's not like we can separate the person out and all of a sudden they're going to be different. So these systems are that context, right? And systems can either widen the chance of success or shrink it. And they can make recovery more possible, or they can make it much harder. And that's why this whole person care idea means paying attention not to just what's wrong inside the person, but also to what's happening around them. Here are some concrete examples of social determinants of health. Housing is, as you all likely know, a really big deal. And even though many of us know it's essential, a lot of programs really don't do enough to help folks learn how to find housing, much less keep housing, and then stay stable once they have housing, right? So one of the things that community support workers in particular can do is really help with that kind of support work, where we're thinking about how to help somebody stay in their housing. How do they develop the skills necessary to maintain a lease, things like this, right? A lot of folks don't get the opportunity growing up or in early adulthood to learn those skills. And so you're often the first folks who they actually get to talk to about this. And we model a lot of that, right? Like we show them how we do it and how it's hard, but it's possible. Income, of course, touches nearly everything. And when folks don't have enough money, it gets harder to do everything from buying food to pay for transportation, to keep their phone on, to afford medication. And as many of us have experienced, probably even one unexpected major expense can really make the whole situation into a really difficult one really fast, right? Transportation, of course, might sound small until you actually look at what it does in the context of care, and especially in a state like New Mexico, where things are really quite far apart. Even our cities, where things are supposed to be close together, it takes 30 minutes if you have a car to drive from one side to the other, if you're lucky, on a good day. But I can't tell you how many people have been discharged or labeled as non-compliant because they missed appointments, and they missed appointments because they couldn't get there. And, treatment organizations, some of which I have worked with, don't exactly send a bus out for them, right? I know folks, those of you who are familiar with the buses in Albuquerque, like it can take all day to get to your appointments. Like it can be your whole day just riding the bus, going to your appointment and trying to do that and take care of that stuff. That means you don't have time for childcare. It means you don't have time for work. It means you don't have time to go to the gym. There's not a lot of extra time. So tending to all those things all of a sudden becomes you don't get to do it because it's too difficult. Of course, food is part of this problem as well. Somebody's hungry, obviously, they're going to have a hard time concentrating. And that obviously affects their mood, it affects their energy, it affects their ability to concentrate, it affects their physical health and their ability to cope with anything else. So we really have to be mindful of a lot of these fundamental social determinants before psychotherapy or before medications can even become remotely effective. And again, this is like a space where community support workers, peer support workers, folks with the CCSS credential can really make a big difference because you all can see a lot of this stuff that these medical providers and prescribers can't. They just don't see folks in the real world, the way that you all do. So keeping that in mind, it's really I can't say it enough, but you are essential to this part of the treatment. Sometimes what we're looking at is actually a symptom, but often it's an adaptation, right? In other words, sometimes it's a strategy that helped the person survive. In this field, and really in the world we're living in today, there's a strong emphasis on this idea, and I keep kind of harping on psychotherapy and medication. But there's this idea that treatments like psychotherapy and medication are the most important part of somebody's treatment plan. Obviously, both are really important, and we shouldn't dismiss them. They can be essential and life-saving. But it gives the impression to clients that medication and psychotherapy alone, or one or the other, are gonna be all they need. And that makes sense because when you have something that says it treats this particular diagnosis, like it's logical, right? It makes sense. You go, okay, this thing treats this thing. And so if I do this thing really well, I should be able to solve this problem, right? But the reality is all of those other things often come in and make it much more difficult, right? So the medication doesn't work because the person didn't get to the med appointment on time. They didn't get their long-acting injection on time, right? And so there's time between the injections. Or with psychotherapy, they didn't actually have anywhere to go practice the homework that the therapist gave them, right? They didn't have time. They were working too many jobs, or they were doing a lot of childcare or taking care of a relative. And so they never got the opportunity to do a lot of that work, which is helpful, right? But if they don't have the time or the space to do that stuff, right? If they can't make those med appointments, if they can't do the homework that's given to them in IOP, they're not going to necessarily succeed. And it's not going to be because the treatment didn't work. It's because all of those other factors, right, influenced the outcome. And so again, this is where you all have a huge role to play because you can help the client understand what those other factors are. You can acknowledge and validate the reality that a lot of those factors are real. Like they're not just excuses, right? Like I couldn't make the bus isn't just an excuse. It's a reality for a lot of folks. So a lot of the work can be about how do we make sure you don't miss the bus the next time? And so again, a lot of this work or a lot of what I'm talking about today is about bringing us all back to how people actually live their lives, how they live their lives between med appointments, how they live their lives between IOP sessions and the like, and less about the diagnosis. So even though this seminar is all about co-occurring disorders, like I'm really trying to get us to like think about the fact that that is a factor, right? The diagnosis, the symptoms, all of those that's all real, but the reality of the way that they live their lives has more to do with it than the diagnosis itself, right? And one of the ways that we see this in the science is we get big differences in outcomes often, right? So we'll do some randomized control trial and we'll have a bunch of people who have depression and we'll go in and we can use statistical methods to sort of sort out why it is some people succeeded and why some people did not. And often, more often than not, unfortunately, it's these social determinants of health, these functional impacts that have kept them from being able to succeed, and for the medication to be successful or from the therapy or approach to be successful. So I'm going to give you a little case example. I got a friend who works at MDC or the Metropolitan Detention Center as a MD there. And he sees a lot of this kind of systems impact all the time. And it's a really good illustration of systems as context. One of his patients receives really good care, of course, under his care while they're in jail. But it's brief, right? This person's only in there for a few weeks or a few months, and then several months go by and this person comes back. And my friend, the doctor, says, were you able to take care of your cancer between the last time I saw you and the present moment? And of course, the client says no, and why not? Well, as soon as you get released from MDC, this guy's back on the street. He has no supports. There is no continuity of care. He has no treatment providers. And so he's not able to maintain his treatments, right? And so his condition worsened significantly when it didn't have to. And again, this is where a lot of community support work and community health workers can come in and really help somebody like that, right? We can help them reentry. We can help them manage those appointments and make sure they get there, things like that. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit now, again, in the chat for a few minutes about what social determinants are most affecting your clients' lives. So just go ahead and, thinking back to that slide, but here are a couple of examples. And so think about an example, and then if you can, write a little bit about why that was impactful or why it was a problem. That'd be great. And if you want to come off mute, we have time. Actually, we're on time. If somebody wants to come off mute and give us an example, that'd be great too. Sleep hygiene. I see that in the chat. My chat is over here and I can't seem to move it. So anybody else? Other social determinants that you've noticed impacting your clients? Maybe some examples. There we go. They're coming in now. A death in the family. That's a really good one. I mean, it's an unfortunate one, but it really disruptive, right? Something like that happens and it's really disruptive. It's a really hard time to maintain care when that sort of thing. Rising cost of living. Yeah. I saw some number out there recently that showed that the average price of a home relative to the typical income is now 4 or 5 times more than it was 20 years ago. And that's adjusted for inflation. So homelessness, yes, absolutely. Children, big one, right? We see a lot of this. Somebody's got to take care of the kids. Otherwise, CYFD is going to get called, right? So what happens? Well, the person who's responsible for taking care of the kids, and let's be frank, it's usually the mother, is, they're not going to be able to make it to treatment that day. And then their treatment suffers, right? Family size, yeah, if there's a lot of folks in a family, that can be a challenge. Um, Somebody mentioned the reentry. I couldn't quite read it. It happened so fast. Let's go back to that. Oh, sorry, that was somebody trying to get back into the. All right, no method of contact, no phone. Yeah, that's super common, right? Like, unfortunate again, but really hard to deal with. Like, a lot of these new psychotherapy approaches require having an app on your phone. And if the therapist we're working with doesn't know that our client doesn't have a phone or have access to a phone, they're going to assign a bunch of homework. Our client's going to be like, they don't want to tell the therapist that they don't have a phone, right? Because that can be embarrassing, shame-inducing for some folks, right? And some people won't tell them. And so it's on us to notice that and say, hey, therapist, this client doesn't have a phone. Let's make a paper copy of that homework. Maybe we can do it that way. And then offer, if you can, one of the things that we've had great success with is when we do the homework together, right? Like a lot of the CCSS workers that I've worked with, we very much intentionally sit down and do that homework together, whatever it is, and make sure that that way the client gets to do the learning, has that opportunity to do it. Clothing, utilities, fear due to being an immigrant right now. That's a big one, of course, and not a small thing. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. Food insecurity, no email, or they don't check their email. Yeah. ACEs. Yeah, I mentioned adverse childhood events, but I didn't say ACEs. But yeah, I'm glad somebody out there caught that. The adverse childhood events can be a big driver for a lot of trauma responses. And I think we have plenty of responses there. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up a little ahead of schedule so that we can talk a little bit more about this and maybe have a little more time to do the activities. So now we're going to sort of take a shift in stance. We had been talking a lot about problems and barriers and all of the issues, but we had been talking about the importance of integrated care, right? In this integrated approach, not treating one problem over here and another problem over there, but really thinking again about how do we integrate these things together? How do we make sure when we are addressing one problem at a time that we're addressing the most important one? And the best way, again, to figure that out is to ask the person, about functional impacts. What is impacting you the most? What is creating the greatest risk? What's most dangerous? And then addressing those dangers, issues of safety, right, first, and especially as they relate to one problem or the other, and then remembering to come back and start thinking about both problems together. So from that point, we want to take a shift and start talking about strengths. This way of working asks us to look for assets in more than one place, right? Some are inside the person, might be awareness, insight, resilience, self-knowledge. Some are going to be around the person, their families, when they have positive family relationships, positive communities, support from support groups, mutual help groups, their connections, any kinds of resources they might have. So rather than seeing people as only a collection of symptoms or problems, we're going to start asking what is present that can actually be used and strengthened to overcome some of those challenges. And that changes our conversation quite a bit, right? Instead of only asking what's wrong, we might ask, who's still with you? Who's still your friend through all of this, right? Because that person who's still your friend through all of this is the kind of person that you can really rely on and really trust. And so we're going to want to try to find that person, for example. We're going to want to ask what's helped you get through hard times before, right? Because when people can actually think back on those previous experiences, even if they've relapsed, even if they're coming into you at their lowest point, they have gotten there by being a survivor, right? Those are strengths. That is I lived in New York City for a long time, and we call it chutzpah, right? It's like the ability to really show up and through it all. And it's a super strength. People don't realize it. I think a lot of people in recovery do because they see themselves as having survived all of that stuff. And now they've come out on the other side and they realized that if you can take a beating like that, you are strong, right? And so what I'm trying to encourage you here is to look for all of those things that are happening in their lives where they have resisted those punches and resisted that pain and managed to come back again and try to identify that stuff. Some of this stuff's really easy to miss if we're moving too fast, right? If we're looking at our clipboard and we're not looking at the client and listening to the client tell us what those strengths are, we're going to see our clipboard. We're not going to see what's actually in front of us, which is the client telling us their story. So we want to be paying very close attention to what is actually their resilience, right? What actually did they do in the past that has helped them? For example, they might not say that they have insight, right? But they can tell you exactly what happened before things started falling apart, right? They can tell you what those moments were leading up to the moment where, their husband left them, their wife left them, whatever happened. They might not think they have support, but there might be that family member again or that friend who really did show up. Maybe that's a pastor, maybe it's a peer, maybe it's a neighbor, right? But people often have these other people, and they often have these resources, internal resources that they don't think are special, but they are. They're the thing that really made the difference in previous experiences. And so if you can start tapping into those previous experiences and figure out what they are, you can start building on that. And so the rest of this section is going to be about how do we do that? How do we actually identify some of those strengths? Because it's easy to see pathologies. As human beings, we have a tendency, thanks to evolution, to look for the worst in ourselves and in others. Because if you think about what it was like, 100,000 years ago for our ancestors, if you didn't detect a threat or something bad right away, it'd kill you. So we have extremely well developed threat detection. Okay. We can do that better than anything else. But that comes at a cost, which means we do not have equally well developed strength detection. All right. When we're looking for the positive in other people, it's harder to see than the negative. And this is, again, our evolutionary nature. Like this is just the way we've been programmed to survive. But when we start looking for it and we really start paying attention to it, it turns out that it makes a huge difference, right? One of the things positive psychology has taught us over the last 20 years is that kind of work, this strengths-focused work, actually makes a better impact than deficit-focused work. Telling somebody what's wrong and that they have to fix the thing that's wrong does not work as well as telling them what's right and how to make that thing that's right better, right? So that's advice giving. So we also know that like when we do that work ourselves internally, we're much more likely to succeed. So this is a kind of a guardrail. Strength does not mean denial. All right. It does not mean false positivity. And it does not mean ignoring risk. If someone's unsafe, if they're using heavily, if they're severely depressed, if they're having suicidal ideation, if they're growing more and more psychotic, or they're getting exploited, or they're losing ability to function, we do not help them by putting a bright, uplifting frame on all of that. We help them by seeing them clearly. So the balance frame here is the real point. Strengths work means seeing capacities and risks at the same time. That might sound obvious, but in practice, people often drift to one side or the other. Some of us have a tendency, again, to fall back into that seeing only the negative, right? Seeing only the problems, and then being like, why doesn't my client see all these problems the way I do? Well, part of that is because nobody wants to see their own problems And we have this tendency again to say, we're problem oriented. Some people have the opposite problem though, and they tend to just be like, try to paint a rosy picture on everything. We really want to tie this middle path where we're seeing both the problems and the strengths accurately. So we're trying to find a more disciplined way of noticing strengths. Strengths are going to be very specific. These are not just vague, like he's a happy person, or they're great, or I really like them. We want to say exactly what we mean. They're observable. We can see them, we can hear them, we can point to them in a person's behavior, history, or relationships. They're useful. They're not just flattering descriptions. They're things that have that may actually work. And they're often connected to next steps. In other words, a real strength gives us somewhere to go and points a direction. So, for example, someone shows up even when they're ashamed, right? That's a strength. A lot of people might not do that. That tells us something very concrete. The shame is present, right? But the person's still willing to show up. That means there's a real commitment. That means they're able to tolerate the distress that comes along with that shame. And there's something there like hope that we can work with. Protective toward children. That might point to some values, motivation, and a place to begin when talking about things like safety, stability, or recovery. Knows one trusted person to call, right? That's not a huge support network by any stretch of the means, but it's not nothing, right? It gives us one live connection we might be able to strengthen. Has succeeded before and can name what helped. That gives us some history. That gives us their capacity for memory. And it gives us some practical information. We're no longer starting from zero. So the question becomes, what have you actually seen that can help this person take the next step? And that's usually a much better question than asking whether or not they have strengths in some sort of broad, abstract way. These, of course, coming back to the domains of CCSS work, we're going to try to relate these strengths directly to these. Independent living might be a person who cannot do everything right now, but still keeps an appointment. They keep their room in order, or maybe they remember to take their medications every day. Learning might be a person who can name patterns, what sets them off, what helps calm them down, what usually happens before things go, south. Working should also not be understood just as vocation or just as like paid work. It can also be understood a little bit more broadly. Caregiving, school, helping family, volunteering, rebuilding their lives, willingness to take on structure and responsibility. Socializing might not necessarily mean a big network. It might mean one safe person, one honest relationship, or one place where the person still feels like they belong. Recreation might be something simple like walking, might be music, might be going to church. And across all the domains, just think, where does this person already have some footing we can build on? Whatever it is. Now I'm going to bring up my favorite subject, recovery capital. It's another way to think about strengths. It pushes us to think about them a little bit more broadly, again, sort of addressing those social determinants in a way. Because now we're not just talking about what's like good or strong about the person, but we're also asking about the resources that exist in their relationships and in their communities. More technically, the technical definition of recovery capital are the breadth and depth of internal and external resources that can be drawn on to initiate and sustain recovery. And those resources are often grouped as personal, social, or community. Cultural capital is not really separate from those. It's rather, think about it as braided in them. There's nothing that you can sort of separate out that isn't in some way culturally influenced. It often shapes what strengths look like. It helps determine which people you turn to, what recovery means in your community, where you actually feel like you belong, and which community resources actually feel usable, safe, or congruent to your identity. So this gives us a much more systematic way to think about what supports recovery while keeping culture in view as something that runs through all of it and not something that gets added on later or is adjunctive, right? This is a quote from the book where the idea of recovery capital was introduced by a sociologist and a social worker named Granfield and Cloud back in 1999. And it really helps sort of sharpen this point. They were studying a group of 46 people who had recovered from what we would call a severe alcohol use disorder or severe drug use disorder, including methamphetamine and I think cocaine and a couple of other pretty serious drugs. And they recovered without formal treatment. In other words, none of these folks went into IOP, none of these folks went into residential treatment, went into the hospital. And nor did they go to AA or NA or any other mutual help group. These folks recovered in their communities from these serious substance use issues. So it's not a story about treatment doing this work, nor is it about 12-step participation doing that work. It was a study of what we call natural recovery. I'm not trying to say that treatment or mutual aid aren't important, all right? They really can be essential for a lot of people. But for some folks, that's not what drives their recovery. And this group that they studied, where they studied this, lets us see this clearly. They don't recover because they enter a program. They also recover or fail to recover in relation to the resources and conditions surrounding them. What Granfield and Cloud found was that people who recovered naturally often had social and material resources they could draw on: relationships, roles, stability, social standing, and other forms of connection and support. And when those resources had been damaged or stripped away, recovery became much harder. So the implication is, again, not that treatment doesn't matter, it's that context also matters, right? Treatment might be one source of recovery capital for some folks, and mutual aid might be another. But this work shows that even in the absence of both, recovery still happens. It's actually the majority of cases for severe substance use problems that people recover without treatment and without mutual aid. But that doesn't mean that they don't use resources. Again, they do, right? Whether those resources are particular to them is sort of your work. And so that's what we're going to explore here, is how to identify recovery capital. Sometimes it's about going to an AA meeting, but for some people it isn't, right? And so we want to help people make that decision. Personal capital or individual level capital is what a person can draw on within themselves and their immediate life. This could include things like insight. Again, we keep coming back to this idea of insight, persistence, values, skills, health, hope, or the ability to get back up after a setback. It can also include practical resources close at hand, like a phone, a car, stable medication access, income, or a workable daily routine. A personal cultural capital names the strength a person carries through a culture. These might be things like language, their belief system, practices, cultural practices, their identity, ways of making meaning, ways of relating, and ways of staying grounded. So here, what we're asking is, what, again, does this person already have that recovery can build on? Social capital is what becomes available through a committed relationship. So these are not your Facebook friends or people who like your Instagram posts, but these are people in networks with real trust, obligation, reliability, or follow through. This kind of goes back to this idea of authenticity that we brought up a few moments ago, where in a social relationship, part of what drives trust is this feeling like that person is authentic, right? I trust them because they're not making a bunch of stuff up about themselves to impress me, right? They're telling me a truth about themselves. It's relatable. I get it. That authentic relationship is a kind of social capital. Social cultural capital points to relationships connected to their cultural identity. This might be where they feel or among whom they feel like they belong. which community they feel most comfortable in. It's not just who knows you, but who knows you in a way that really fits you and who you are. Community capital is what becomes available through access or in the community, right? These are often the resources that are not people, but these are the kind of doors that open around them. These are the services, access to folks like yourselves, the organizations, the opportunities and spaces and institutions that actually make recovery and daily life more possible. Community cultural capital points to places and activities and organizations that connect with the person's cultural identity or sense of belonging. So this resource is not just available, but it's useful and usable to them, and it's congruent with their identity. So we're going to get into this tool, which we've developed here in New Mexico, called the Recovery Capital Self-Discovery and Planning Tool. It's basically a menu of 48 recovery capital strengths that I have created these lists. And I did a lot of this work with folks out in Gallup and in Santa Fe and in Albuquerque, but also when I was working out east in Massachusetts. And so this is all of the items on this list come from peer support workers, case managers, community health workers, community support workers, social workers, and clinicians, and some researchers, and researchers who study this particular problem. So this isn't just some random list of things that I think are great. This is a list of things that a lot of these folks here in the community think are helpful. And this is what you're going to see. We have in your handout, you should have seen, or you should have something that looks like this, or the second page of it looks like this. This is the personal capital section. You're going to rank these things from 1 to 6, where 6 is you have a lot of it, and 1 you have very little or none, right? This is what the social capital one looks like. Again, you're going to look through these things and you're going to identify those things that really are helpful. And then this is the community capital one. And again, same kind of idea. This is about access to those resources external to you or external to your social situation. And so now, if everybody, we're going to go back into the groups, and each of you should independently complete steps 1 through 3 on the worksheet. And those are pages 1 through 4. It'll take about 15 minutes to do that. So it'll be relatively quiet work. And then in the group, choose one group member's case, right, to share with the other group. Complete the recovery capital building plan on page 5 altogether, and then assign one person to fill it out and share it with the main group on completion. There's a sample on page 6, excuse me, and that part where the share out will take about 5 minutes. So this is a pretty long activity, and I think we're ready to go. All right, welcome back, folks. As you're all coming back in, a couple of folks, we have time for just a couple of folks to share their plans. And so if you'd raise your hand if you want to share your group, whatever you came up with, and it'd be fantastic. Don't be shy. I say this as a shy person.
Share briefly, real quick. So we didn't do the survey itself. We really dived into dissecting the surveys, and really just being appreciative of the questions that are on the surveys. I think this gives us a great opportunity for us to understand the functional domains with the clients. The questions are great. Really good transparency that the clients are giving us a lot of information with these surveys right off the bat. And so I was telling the group that I really want to plug this in kind of as an intro with some of our peer support groups also, like, because this is a great piece to really add into what we're doing.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like that's how it's used. And again,
Mhm.
I mean, for some folks, it may be appropriate to hand it to them and say, "Hey, fill this out."
Mhm.
But the real idea is that it's a conversation starter, right? Like
Yeah,
you're
absolutely.
actually engaging them directly and chatting about the items that they chose and kind of why they chose them. Because a lot of people, if one of the things that we've noticed is that when we do this in clinics, you'll have the occasional client who will just like straight line the thing and just be like, "You're not going to read this. I don't care." Right? And so the first way you start developing some trust and some safety around using a survey like this is to sit down and be like, actually, I do care. Like, let's pick out two or three of those things that really do matter to you. And maybe the rest of them don't, and that's okay. And, I've also had situations where people are like, there's only one thing on here that is a strength for me, you know? And my answer to that is like, we've got one thing. Let's work from there. If we can find one thing, that's a place to start. And sometimes you'll find people who don't want to put even one thing, right? You'll find people who are just like, nope, it's all bad. And again, you could start probing around those questions with those conversations that you should be having, which are like, tell me a little bit more about why it's so rough. And they'll tell you. And then you can start thinking about as you listen to them, some of the things that they're going to say are going to kind of contradict themselves, right? Because it's hard to be on this planet and not find something. And as soon as you can find that sort of little crack, if you've ever heard the expression, the crack is where the light comes in. So that's kind of the thing you're looking for. You're looking for that little crack, that little window where just a little bit of light's coming through. And that's how we build on strengths. Find that little bit of information and start working with it. Does anybody else have one that they want to share? I know it's kind of complicated, or it can feel a little complicated and overwhelming, but
So this is Draylene. Yeah, it was a bit complicated just because it was like the timing and stuff like that. It was very like fast and it was kind of like jumping back and forth. I would probably, to be honest, need a little bit more time on that. But what I really enjoyed was the questions, because I feel like sometimes the questions on the assessments or the crisis safety plans and the recovery and resilience plans are very basic. And even I get bored asking the clients. I'm like, this is boring. Like, we need to switch it up. So I really like I really like the questions, and I feel like it does crack the clients up a little bit. So
all right. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that feedback. This was the first time we've done this activity, and we were commenting while you guys were all in the groups that we were having some timing challenges because it's just hard to figure out where everything is in terms of timing and where the explanation is. And so we appreciate that. But I'm glad that the tool seems useful. I think one of the key things, the last point I'll make about the tool is that the goal is, again, to really find the strengths. Like a lot of those other assessments that, I certainly use in therapy practice and everything, they're a bummer. They're so negative, right? There's all these problems, and the person's job is to sit there and just like tick all these boxes of all these problems. And it's so often, it just doesn't feel like they're getting the support that they need. And they often, the conversations that go from there are just, they're starting in that problem space, in that problem mindset. And again, like I was saying, we as humans have a tendency to stay there. But cognitive behavioral therapy and all these other positive psychology, all this stuff is demonstrated time and time again that if we can find those strengths, we can find those things that are going well for somebody, even if it's just a little bit, and we start building on that step by step, slowly, carefully, safely, but being mindful of all this context, we will have a much better result than if we just delve into the problem and we stay on the problem, right? The problem, just staying in the problem is never going to solve the problem, right? We have to find the tools in the person's life that are actually going to do that work. And so from there, I'm going to go ahead, and there are some vignettes that you can take the tool and you can use it on those vignettes at home if you have time, if you have an interest. I designed them so that you could start to like practice with this tool and sort of see them and then figure out how to do those SMART goals with case vignettes and maybe think about it. You're welcome to use it in your practice wherever you are. And I'm going to sort of end this here because we're running out of time. But again, relationship first, right? Build that safety, build that trust, slow down, make it so they can hear you, you can hear them, actually work with the stage of change on the problem that they need worked on first. Don't assume just because they have a substance use disorder or they have a co-occurring mental health disorder that you should work on one or the other. Again, that's a conversation that you have with them. It's a conversation that you have with the team. We talked about integrated care and making sure that, you know, the therapist or the prescriber knows what you're doing, right? And you know what they're doing so that you're not overstepping your bounds. Again, always focus on practical steps. You can use that tool to find that recovery capital wherever it is. And at that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Sabrina.
Awesome.